All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Paul Delaria, and this is Do Hard Things Tech View. Today, we have the honor and privilege of welcoming Navisite with us today to talk about their Do Hard Things project around Oracle Exadata Takeout. Peter, Martin, good evening.
Thanks, Paul. Evening.
Tell us a little bit about Navisite. What do you guys do? Where are you from?
Hi, Paul. So Navisite's been a coming together of several companies over the last couple of years. It started with a company called RDX, which acquired a few other companies, one called Clockwork, another called ClearDB, and then we merged with Navisite, and we chose Navisite as our going forward name. And since then, we've added another couple of companies to that. So Prevo, who are a DevOps specialist, and we've also added another company called Velocity, who had a large background in supplying Oracle systems. Myself and Martin come from Clockwork, and we are a specialist in migrating complex Oracle workloads to AWS. And this is something we started as a mission in our company 10 years ago now. And so we've been working on migrating Oracle workloads since then.
Yeah, that's migrating Oracle workloads and complexity can be are words that I hear a lot. I think the thing that really intrigued me and I thought was you took something that was difficult or hard and made it simple was the concept of Exadata. And the fact is you can move Exadata workloads to AWS. And that's something that really intrigued me about Navisite and in our discussions offline about how you guys go about doing that. I thought was just amazingly cool, and I want to make sure that we share that with the rest of the world. So tell me a little bit about some of the problems you see when you look at large Oracle complex workloads and try to migrate them to AWS.
Sure. So, I mean, when you start to look at, say, an Exadata workload that a client has, invariably speaking, this Exadata is running a workload that's critical to the business. So this might be their public-facing workload, how they run their portal, that the customers interact with them. It may be how they generate their billing or shipping, and they have very specific metrics around how these processes need to run. So if you think about a grocery retailer, they might have their online portal, and they've got very important metrics around shoppers checking out. And every second on the checkout can cause abandoned baskets, which at the end of the day is lost revenue. So we, generally speaking, want to help them move these workloads with confidence that when they get there, that workload is going to behave as it does now or better.
Yeah, I think it's really important, us technologists need to understand that we have to measure business success along with the technicals that are underneath that. But, these things that we do affect productivity of workers. They affect the image of the business. They affect the amount of revenue and expenses that a company has. And it's really important that we get it right. And, it's March. So we've been essentially calling this Measure What Matters March. And what that means is, Andy Jassy will say, it's important to get it right and measure the things that are important to the business. So we use the example of you have two people in a room and they're arguing about the height of the room. Is it 16 feet or is it 10 feet? And the two people compromise and say it's 13 feet. Well, that's a compromise, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And getting it right matters when it comes to IT and in providing systems that are highly functional for the business, and then measuring the things that matter to the business as well as the technicals in IT. So Peter, what is it that what you guys measure or look at when you look at moving a large complex Exadata workload to AWS?
For sure. So when we start to engage with these customers, often they've bought into this line an obsession around the disk performance of an Exadata. And so generally speaking, you start to talk to them. They may have been listening to their Oracle account representative who's saying that this can't work anywhere else because nowhere else gives you the IOPS, the throughput of an Exadata. And so they start spouting numbers at you about, I get this many thousand IOPS, or I get a guarantee of this block response time. And these are all proxy measures for performance. They aren't real measures. For us, the measure that really matters is how fast a query runs. So you have a query or a piece of SQL update that needs to run for to go back to that example for the shopping basket checkout. What matters is the point from which that piece of SQL is called to when that piece of SQL is completed. And it's the time that takes. And everything else is really just a proxy measure. It's not really what matters.
Right, understood. So you guys have been doing this a long time, Peter, and we've been working together for a couple of years now, and I've seen the great work that you do. Do you have any customer examples that you can share with us where you've done work like this?
For sure. So one of the things we would do to give customers reassurance that we can run the workload successfully in AWS is to use a piece of Oracle technology called real application testing. And this is a typical example of how we would set that up for a customer so that they could we could then prove the workload in AWS and show that it can happen. So you've got your on-prem Exadata or big Oracle database that's running that high-profile system. And the first thing we would do is record a real-world example of workload work that's occurring in that database. So typically, we'd be expecting to find sort of peak workload. If they're doing a batch workload, we would record the entire night, or if they're in the evening shopping experience, we would record the evening. And once we've recorded that, we would then take a copy of the database, back it up, along with all of the files that have been generated by real application testing. We would then move that up to AWS, generally via an S3 bucket. And then once we've got it to an S3 bucket, even if the eventual target is an Oracle RDS, our first target for testing these workloads would, generally speaking, be on EC2. There are some good reasons for that, because when we use EC2, we've got a bit more control of how the configuration works. And we can also use a piece of Oracle technology called flashback database. So we would restore the database, and then we would set a flashback recovery point. We would then run a test, and then we would flash the database back to the beginning of the test. And that's a very quick operation. So generally speaking, to get to a point where we're comfortable that the workload is performing correctly, we're expecting to run a minimum of 20 to 30 test iterations. And really, we want to get through those test iterations really quickly. If we went straight to RDS, there's a bit of a time lag while we have to restore the databases, and then we can perform a second iteration. So what we would do is we would use flashback on EC2. We would rapidly get ourselves to a set of configuration parameters around, what Amazon disk, instance size, memory allocation gives us the right kind of performance as to compare to the on-prem database. And then we would then take that database over to RDS once we're comfortable with it on EC2, and then we would rerun the test on RDS and check if there's anything else we need to tweak or tune when we hit RDS. But generally speaking, once we've hit RDS, we're not expecting to run a huge number of additional test iterations. We should be pretty much there. And then once we've finished the testing, one of the things that RAC gives to us is this side-by-side comparison of the SQL statements in the on-prem database versus the AWS database.
Right, that's great. And since this is a tech view, we always like to go even deeper than people expect us to, right? So I think Martin and I and you are gonna go through actually some of that side-by-side comparison of a real world example. But before we go to that, let me just make sure, Peter, I was thinking about this customer that you've done this for, and some of the technicals are important in doing this, but what the outcome of that was a reduced risk profile for this customer, right? They were able to, move a workload to AWS and have infinite scale. They were able to lower their capital investment because these services are purchased, in a variable usage model that's not tied to a license agreement. And they were able to free the resources to do things that are more valuable for the business. They don't have to watch the blinking lights on the CPU anymore. They can actually think about the performance of the workload. So reduce risk profile, lower capital investment, and increase productivity of resources were kind of the business outcomes of that migration using the real application testing suite that you mentioned.
That's correct. And we can prove all kinds of scenarios as part of the real application testing. So we can be running workloads while we do failover and recovery tests as well. So we're simulating real workloads when it comes closer to that operational acceptance test.
So like we've said, it is measure what matters March. So, I understand we can measure disk IOPS and CPU and memory and all sorts of other cool technicals, but what about measuring the actual query performance? Can you guys, do you think you can, walk us through a demo of how you guys would go about doing that for a business?
Yeah, for sure. We could walk you through a sample wrapped capture and replay, if you like that.
Yeah, it'd be great, Martin. Before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Martin? What's your background? And people will be interested in that as well.
Sure, thank you. I've been with Navisite for 5.5 years. I come from an Oracle DBA background originally, and then I got into AWS with Clockwork, and my mind was blown about how quickly you could do things and get things working. It was very liberating.
Great. Well, it's nice to meet you, and I appreciate you spending some time with us today. So yeah, why don't you walk us through a quick demo? We got time to kind of show us some of these query parameters and what it would look like, before when it was on-prem to afterwards when it's on AWS, and what those numbers look like.
Sure. Here we go. So this is a report that has been generated between a capture run, the original run, and then a replay in AWS. And this report showed you the runtimes statistics between the two reports. So the thing we're interested in is the SQL by elapsed time. So this section of the report allows you to drill down, and you can identify the critical SQLs for your business. What are the ones that really matter to you? As Pete was mentioning, say, putting things into a basket would be a good example. And you can specifically work out which one of these SQLs that is, and then you can drill down and look at the runtime, first run versus second run, and what the difference is. So we were looking for better performance. If you find something that's not performing, you can then drill into it. Okay, so just to give a little bit of technical background, to get to this point, first of all, we have to do the capture. So we set up a capture on the source database. This just allows wrapped to capture all the information, all the SQLs. This is just showing that we're going to be ramping up and collecting all the information. Here we go. We've got some transactions coming in. So we're going to have up to 400 users in this example. And then that'll run for an amount of time. It might be an overnight run, it might be for an hour. And then you transfer all that information to AWS, you copy the database, and then you're ready to do your replay. So you set up your load generators. You then say go, hit go, and then you have the SQL running. When that's all finished, you can then generate this report. This is the output from that process. And then this is what you can then base your decisions on where to tune, where to tweak.
So let me dive in a little bit on that, if I could, Martin. So tell me, I'm looking at that first SQL statement ID there that ends in ZSP, and I see elapsed time first of 2,034 milliseconds, and then elapsed time second of 12. So what is first and what is second? Can you walk me through what those two things represent?
Yeah, so the elapsed time milliseconds per execution of that statement. So we've gone from taking 2,000 milliseconds up to 12 milliseconds for that particular statement. So that's obviously seen a big improvement per execution.
Yeah, and that's what matters, right? Because if you're a business user or an end user and you're running this SQL query statement and you're able to get that SQL query statement returned, in essentially exponentially less time than before, that's something that delta is significant to a business user. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. It's probably the most important thing to look at, as Pete mentioned, rather than looking at proxy things like number of disk operations. That doesn't really matter. It's about how does the SQL perform, and you can essentially, that's your kind of your benchmark, and you're just looking to get your SQL to run as quickly as possible.
So one thing I've always liked about cloud that I think is a hidden gem is the fact that you don't have to guess at capacity. You can change capacity based on the needs of the business. So what if you were running this on an EC2 instance or an RDS instance, and you realize that your search time was creeping up slowly? What would it take to change out the instance to a larger instance in measuring that impact?
In AWS, it's frankly trivial, pretty much, to change the instance size. With an EC2, you just shut it down and you change the instance size and bring it up, and that's it. With RDS, you choose a new size and the RDS gets rebooted. It's really.
Can you compare that for me? And I know you understand this, but I mean, just trying to give people the idea of what would it have taken before if you were building this on premise, if you realize that your instance type didn't have enough horsepower. What would you have to do, or what would be a typical cycle be like?
If you're unlucky, you might have to provision a new machine. So you're looking at maybe 3 months to get that installed. If you're lucky, another department might have a machine that you can try and steal. But good luck with that.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like you're horse trading, as we would call it over here, and that always can end bad in many different ways. So.
And I think another point to think about, Paul, is that when you're doing this kind of migration work before, when we would have done these kind of database upgrade programs before, we would have bought new hardware with a finger in the air with all of these proxy measures and go, well, it's got X more IOPS or more CPU or whatever. And then the new hardware would turn up and we might run one of these tests as okay, let's just check everything works. But it's really too late because we bought it. Now, we can take that database to AWS, we can run this test, and we can know it's going to work before we even go and spend any serious money.
Right. So moral of the story is stop the vicious cycle of hardware procurement and focus on the business outcome and results by moving your Exadata workloads to AWS. It can be done, and Navisite and AWS can help you make that happen. I agree. So, Peter, Martin, I really appreciate you spending some time with us today and going through this and taking this hard thing of migrating an Exadata workload to AWS and proving that it works and measuring the business results. That's something that's difficult to do, and you've made it seem simple and explained it in a very short amount of time. If somebody was watching this and wanted to engage with you or Navisite in a deeper way or learn more, is there a way they could go about doing that?
Sure. If I just take the screen back, shall we?
All yours.
So if you wanted to get hold of us, we've got an ebook on Exadata Takeout that's available to download on our website, and you can register to get hold of that. Or if you want to get hold of us in a more direct fashion, you could just email us at hello@navisite.com and we'll be in touch with you.
And the last thing I'd ask, if you found this valuable, give us thumbs up, give us some feedback, subscribe to our page, our YouTube page, Do Hard Things, and share this with your friends and coworkers. With that, Peter and Martin, it's been a pleasure. And I just want to thank you for diving deep with us on Do Hard Things Tech View, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Paul.
See you again.